It's Jeff Breedlove with the American Addiction Recovery Association, and we are in conversation with Elenore Sturko from Canada, a great leader in the government up there in British Columbia. And I'm with my partner, Coach Scott Cochran. Coach, how are you doing today?
Fantastic. Some real talk about addiction and recovery. So grateful to have you on, Elenore. Thank you so much for coming on. Really excited to dig in.
I'm super grateful that you guys have me on. So thank you. Nice to meet you both.
Well, Elenore, this podcast, we like to think that soon it'll be on the Spotify top list. But as it grows in America, not everybody is an expert on American politics and government, much less Canadian politics and government. So tell folks you are an elected official. Explain to our mostly American audience about what office you hold and how that works in the Canadian government. And then tell us a little bit about yourself.
Sure. So I'm a member of the Legislative Assembly of British Columbia. So that's sort of like a state government. And our provincial government here has an opposition and it has the government. And I'm currently an independent member of the opposition. So I was formerly the critic for mental health and addiction for British Columbia. And I was the critic for the Solicitor General and Public Safety. And now I'm the critic for whatever I want. But my passion really is safety, mental health, addictions, and making life better for my constituents. I'm a former RCMP officer, so part of the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. I stopped as a sergeant of the Royal Canadian Mounted Police when I got elected for the first time in 2022. And I just really have enjoyed my work, especially fighting for people with untreated mental illness and addictions up here in Canada.
Now, you're in recovery yourself. That's very public.
Yes. Yeah. I actually, as a police officer, I got PTSD from some of the experiences I had. I ended up having a substance use issue with alcohol. I'm lucky because being a veteran, I was also in the Canadian Armed Forces, but the RCMP are part of Veterans Affairs in Canada. I had access to seeing a registered psychologist and was able to get help to go into recovery. In Canada, it's not covered in British Columbia for people to get help with their mental health or if they need a counselor. So I was lucky in that regard. And it's one of the reasons why I've actually been an advocate for getting free mental health and addictions treatment for everybody in Canada, because without that free and accessible access, it's really a barrier for people. And I just feel incredibly blessed and lucky to be in recovery and to have been surrounded by all those resources as a veteran. And I really think that whether you serve or not, people deserve to have a chance at recovery.
Well, thank you for your leadership. Now, I got to know you through the documentary Fentanyl Death Incorporated. And you are just a resolute leader in this broader policy around the addiction epidemic. Because, we know there's an international border between America and Canada, but the disease, it doesn't know. It's just a disease. And I'm sure we'll get into some Canadian perspectives today, but thanks for being in that documentary. And of course, one reason I really wanted you to come on is I tried to outrun my disease, and I'm a Georgia boy, born and bred. But God took me out west when I was outrunning the disease. And I would get a job and lose a job because I just couldn't, I couldn't stay in recovery, and I wasn't using every day. But, for a while I lived in Spokane, Washington, and for a while I lived in Portland, Oregon. And my wife and I would go to BC quite a bit. I genuinely believe you live in arguably the most beautiful part of the world, between Oregon, Washington, and BC than any place. And I just I'd like to be in your district. I'd like to be where you are.
We were pretty much neighbors before.
We were. But that was 20 years ago, but 25 years ago. But, tell us a little bit about, besides just being a person in recovery, give us an overview of what is going on in BC right now, and maybe the rest of Canada, with the addiction epidemic. I mean, what are you seeing on the ground there? What drugs are manifesting themselves now? What issues are resonating with families and businesses and communities? Most of us don't know what's going on in Canada. Bring us up to speed.
Yeah, we have a pretty severe problem here, still persistent. the most deadly substance that we're dealing with here, of course, being fentanyl. But we also have, drugs on the street being cut with xylazine and other veterinary medications that are making it more difficult to reverse overdoses, but also leading to absolutely horrific infections and wounds on individuals. Because we use widely Narcan here as well, giving people naloxone. We have a lot of brain damage in Canada as well. People who have unfortunately suffered anoxic brain injuries. And so coping with dealing with the needs now of people who not only are addicted to drugs, but potentially have brain damage and other challenges, like this is a huge problem that we don't actually have enough resources to deal with, to be frank with you. I think luckily over the last, probably I would say since I got elected in 2022 and really started hammering on a lot of these issues, we've made some substantial changes. Even since I participated in Fentanyl Death Incorporated, some of the policies that I spoke about in the documentary have actually been reversed. We don't have vending machines with safe supply in them anymore. We don't have, crack pipe delivery to your door, anymore. So I think that those are positive changes, but the reality on the ground is that we still have 5 people a day losing their lives in British Columbia. And, this is really, really a horrific situation that we're dealing with. The depth of human suffering that we're dealing with is a humanitarian crisis. And the reality is that we really struggle, I think, as a province to build the capacity of the things that we actually need to service and to provide care for individuals who are in this predicament. We're being outpaced by the illness itself.
Let's be candid. There's critics in BC and in Canada that criticize some of those common sense changes that have occurred. And that's one reason why AARA exists, is that we believe that the voices on, the far right, both in Canada and America, who say lock them up and throw away the key. That's not the answer for everybody, everything, all the time. And then there's voices on the far left that are just like, everything goes, no accountability, no nothing. Just get out of the way and give them whatever they want. Well, that's not going to fly. But we think, there's, and I know the percentages, but illustratively, I think there's 80% of folks in the middle in both Canada and America that just want bipartisan, common sense solutions that can be supported by families and survivors, peers like the 3 of us. And they're just looking for real solutions. But I'm deeply curious to know, what do you say to the critics who when you make the case that unfettered access to drugs and the tools for drugs isn't really recovery, it isn't really the best, what do you say to them, and how do you deal with that kind of criticism?
Yeah, well, I think one of the issues that we had in BC and that we still struggle with to some extent is an ideology that really pushed an excessive permissiveness. Anything goes, and the rights of the individual, the rights of the one really outpacing and outbalancing the rights of society. And so, really enabling and allowing for behaviors that break the social contract, public intoxication to the extent where people in psychosis from drugs, smashing windows, defecating in doorways, creating a menace on the streets that, intimidates people from shopping in our businesses, or, having even intoxicated individuals entering into schools across the province and creating situations where people feel they can't use their neighborhood park. And so what do I say to the critics? And I don't know, anyone who's followed my career would see that in the beginning, it was a pretty lonely space that I occupied here in British Columbia, speaking out against what was a very strong, and I'm going to just say it, an activist agenda pushing towards the legalization of hard drugs in British Columbia. And there wasn't a lot of opposing voices early on. There was a couple of key issues that I really fought against. One of them was this idea of unwitnessed safe supply, where people were being given drugs, large quantities of it. They weren't being tested if they were taking it, not witnessed to take it. What ended up happening here in British Columbia is that a significant amount of people who were receiving these prescriptions for Dilaudid, so dealies, they're called on the street, were actually trafficking those to trade it for street drugs or using them as a currency, right? Just to fuel the fentanyl crisis, giving money essentially to the gangs and cartels that we are fighting actively. And they weren't getting better. And in some cases, likely died of fentanyl overdoses when they should have been receiving help. And so, how did I speak against them? I didn't speak to those people. I actually looked for the evidence to prove that what I was saying was correct, that what I was saying was legitimate. One of the first things that happens when you fight against some of the more radical policies is that people try to paint you as someone who is stigmatizing others. Try to say that you don't care, that you're trying to kill people who use drugs. Obviously not the case. My belief has always been there's probably a role for pharmaceuticals to play in helping get people into recovery off of street drugs, titrating them over to other medications. But we need to make sure that they have a therapeutic benefit and that they're not falling into the hands of other citizens to become then also subsequently addicted to opioids. So I didn't spend a lot of my time actually trying to convince those who I think I would have a hard time convincing. Instead, I really dug in. Earlier in 2025, I obtained a document that was a leaked government document that actually confirmed that in British Columbia, a significant, quote unquote, amount of quote unquote safe supply was being diverted and trafficked provincially, nationally, and internationally. That within 3 days of me leaking that to the media and doing media, the government changed its policy to no longer have unwitnessed safe supply going into the streets, which I'm really proud of. And so for me, this is it's about evidence. It's about making not necessarily a tit for tat argument, but let's find out what the real truth is here. Is there a role for medications to help people who have addiction? 100%, in my opinion. Should we monitor those people and make sure that it's helping them? Absolutely. And do we need to sometimes look at the rights of the society and the many over the rights of the individual? Of course. So those who make the arguments, you guys have your constitution. We have a constitution and the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. You guys have the Bill of Rights. So, there's lots of arguments on our charter that, some activists say that they have a constitutional right to do drugs. But I also argue that everybody else who lives in the society also has the constitutional right to be able to live in a safe society, to live in a society free from, uncapped needles on the streets or being attacked by someone in psychosis, not having someone defecate on the doorway of your shop. We all have rights and freedoms, and there is actually a social contract between all of us that we need to make sure that we're taking good care of and meeting people where they're at and not leaving them there.
Coach, what you got?
Yeah. How bad is the homeless? Is homeless really? I have no idea. But as I have two questions. Really, the homeless side. How bad is it? In British Columbia, and also, we're having this conversation all the time of, mandated prison sentences for certain drug dealers. One side says this, the other side says this, and we're trying to get the majority. Everybody kind of wants the same thing, but then there's this 10% here, 10% there. Everybody goes to jail. Nobody goes to jail. What type of laws are y'all dealing with when it comes to the dealer of fentanyl and having someone overdose? And how bad is the homelessness in British Columbia?
Homelessness is a crisis for us in BC. And if you watch any Canadian news, which I don't know to what extent Americans get to watch some of our broadcasts up here, we certainly have an opportunity to watch American news from where we sit north of the border. But we have a very severe homeless crisis, not just in BC, but across the country. A lot of it related to untreated mental illness, addiction, poverty, of course. I'll just tell you, about 2 years ago, I took my family down to Mexico, and we went to a resort in Baja California Sur. And when we were driving from the airport, the chauffeur said, we drove by this kind of little shanty town that had been set up. And the person was so apologetic that Canadians would have to see this, little poverty area. And I just said, you have nothing to apologize for. If you came to Canada, if you came to British Columbia, if you came to my province, you would see something not only that looks like this, but many that look much worse. The reality of what we're dealing with is an unacceptable situation. And, like I said earlier, some of what we're dealing with, frankly, is because the problem has outpaced our ability to provide the capacity that people need. But it's also a result of radical ideology, a push towards that excessive permissiveness, that quote unquote harm reduction, where, there's somehow a safe way to do drugs and live with psychosis on the street and live with brain damage on the street, instead of taking that responsibility, being a bit of a firmer hand in helping guide people and compel them towards the services they need. So one of the things in Oregon, after they got rid of decriminalization and move towards having the change from felony to, we call it summary conviction here. So giving people that opportunity who have criminal entanglements to participate in treatment programs is something that I really, really hope that we do here. So at the end of January, we actually are at the very tail end of a decriminalization experiment that started in 2023, January 31st. It's been a disaster. It has not prevented deaths. It has not reduced the number of overdose deaths in British Columbia. But what it's done is actually really fueled that street disorder issue that we've had. It's really, not lent itself to wellness, I would say, in any way, shape, or form. It was sold to our citizens much in the way that what was happening, in Oregon, which is that, it'll be like a Portugal model and people won't do crimes anymore because they're going to be able to, not be charged for small amounts of drugs. But, people got worse. We had more violence on the streets, more people languishing in suffering. And what I would like to see, though, is for us, we had a model set up in the city of Vancouver called the Drug Treatment Court of Vancouver, that if people had nonviolent crimes and they were willing to participate, they could have a summary conviction, which is same as what Oregon is doing, where you participate. And if you are successful and graduate, that you don't get a criminal record at the end. It's a conditional discharge you receive. So, it's really using our criminal courts to be able to not necessarily send people who use drugs, who are addicted, into prison, but to actually help divert them towards services that can help put them on a path to wellness, with no limitations on the number of times you can attempt to, participate and better yourself. And what the Vancouver Drug Court showed previously was that it reduced the amount of cost for emergency rooms, that while people were participating, even if they didn't graduate the program, they did much better, and they were actually building that self-esteem, getting back on a path and being connected with services that helped. So that's for people who would be caught, for example, committing a nonviolent crime and having drug possession. That's what I'd like to see. Insofar as someone who would import the precursors of fentanyl, cook up a giant batch of crystal meth or fentanyl to export to our neighbors in the States, or, in the Pacific Rim over to New Zealand and Australia. I'm sorry, but I would throw the book at these people. Of course, I want to see those who, as far as I'm concerned, are cooking up batches of mass death. These people need to be held to the fullest extent of the law. And I've found it somewhat frustrating, the level to which the problem with the import of the precursors of fentanyl have been dealt with in our borders. We have a new prime minister who's indicated a lot more action and dedicated more money towards increasing, the vigilance at the border and committing to more inspections of shipments and containers coming in. But, I said it in that documentary, and I'll say it again. At the time of the documentary, we had less than 1% of the 99%, of all containers coming to Canada being physically inspected. That's a huge problem. We need to be able to get a handle on what's coming into Canada, what it's being used for in terms of, deadly drugs that are being shipped, not only, into our own citizens, but, we have to be a good neighbor internationally as well. And I think that our prime minister now has at least made a good indication that that's a path he also agrees is important to take.
Yeah, I think there's been a change with the new prime minister. And Um, you have critics in Canada, and there are critics in America too. Let's go back to the drug court concept. They will call that forced recovery or whatever they'll call it, and they'll throw some stats and some study that shows it doesn't work. But it fascinates me from a policy perspective. And again, I'm in recovery and I face legal consequences. I don't know what our brothers and sisters think. I mean, that the rest of society is just going to go, oh, well, whatever, free pass. I mean, there's got to be some type of accountability. And it seems to me that drug courts, whatever their particular flavor is, it beats the heck out of long-term prison sentences. And it also, gives the rest of society a feeling of safety, if you will.
Yeah. Well, I'll just make a couple comments. Like one of them, first and foremost, is, drug treatment court in both Toronto and Vancouver were actually had very good outcomes and were successful. What made them less successful was that British Columbia, for example, started de facto decriminalization before even the decriminalization experiment, meaning that if people were being caught with drug possession, unless it was associated to some other major crime, they were not being charged. And so the accountability started going away. And people were not getting referred to the drug treatment court because they weren't being charged. So, it's actually an example of how this change in the way that we dealt with drug laws in Canada had this sort of negative effect on helping guide people over to services that were meant to help them. Ultimately, drug treatment court is a choice. And I believe even in Oregon, it's also a choice that people can choose. You plead guilty essentially and agree to go into this, court program where you're being supervised by bail supervisors and participating in a program. And this is a hard road. This is the easier choice would be to say like, no, I don't want to participate. And you may be sentenced to, jail, or you may receive some other type of criminal penalty, but it's a choice. And I think for the critics who would say forced treatment doesn't work, well, two things. First of all, when we're talking about involuntary treatment, especially if we're compelled through the courts because the person is entangled with the justice system and they have problem behavior, we're not talking about forced treatment versus voluntary treatment. We're talking about giving a person this opportunity to participate in treatment versus doing nothing at all. And we're seeing 5 times a day in British Columbia where when we do nothing, people die. So we're comparing the wrong comparator, voluntary versus involuntary. Of course, voluntary is always the preference. Of course, that's the default. We always want people to make a choice for themselves because their motivations will be, of course, different. But it's doing something versus not doing something is what the real question is. And I think what's also important, and one of the things I've actually had discussions with ministers in our government here about how I see this could be a success for the government, and I encourage them and would support them to go down this avenue for the province, is that we're not targeting groups of people. We're not saying we're targeting people with addiction. Certainly not. If we would see that a person has an addiction, we're not like seeing a person even with a pipe in their hand and chasing them down for an arrest. It's not like that. But when we're talking about the real problem behaviors that are breaking the social contract, leading to our chaos on the streets, like we have people walking into Tim Hortons while you're trying to drink your double and you got somebody snorting lines off a table. This is harmful behavior. This, you go onto a SkyTrain, you see videos on social media from up here, and there's people smoking crystal meth on a SkyTrain next to a family. These are the kinds of behaviors that we need to tackle. So this isn't really about targeting groups of people, not targeting addicts, not targeting people with addiction. It's about taking a look at harmful behavior and helping that person to be connected or compelled to services that are meant to help change that behavior. And, we've reached a tipping point here where in British Columbia, a recent survey by one of our business improvement associations said that 1 in 5 British Columbia businesses says it won't survive the next year unless conditions of street disorder change in our province. We have to take action. We have to bring back that accountability that you mentioned.
That is fascinating. I mean, I'm no expert on BC. I do love Victoria, and particularly, and I love Vancouver. And but just, I mean, the addiction epidemic could get to the point where a significant percentage of local businesses might not survive, which then would create a different type of spiral in the community of unemployment, which could then exacerbate itself with mental health and addiction. I mean, you can get to the situation where this was only phase one, if you will, of an ongoing crisis.
Yeah, it's not just the health and safety issues. We're talking about an economic impact.
Right.
So we have our healthcare system's a bit different from the healthcare system that you have in the States. And so we are taxpayer funded, of course. And so we rely heavily on revenues as income. So
Right.
when you have an economy that, is impacted by addiction, and if businesses close, the revenue that those businesses were generating also gets taken out of your health system, which is the opposite of what we need. We need to be able to have a robust healthcare system. We need to be able to have that funding available. And so, I mean, all of it goes together. It's like a giant puzzle. When you don't have health and safety and community wellness, it impacts business. Just like when you don't have a strong business economy, it's hard for us to fund, safety and wellness programs. So all of it has to be functioning. We have to look at it, that old saying, eat the elephant one piece at a time. But we also have to look at the whole elephant. We got to make sure that the entire picture can work together. So I'm a big, proponent of going back to a drug treatment model that involves, the court and being able to use the courts in certain circumstances where people choose to take that path to go into services to help get them into recovery. This, I think, is a great solution. I don't think it's the only solution. At the same time as doing that, we need to have voluntary services available so that if someone says today, they wake up in British Columbia and say, enough is enough, I want to change my life today, that they can walk into that door, and that door is the open door ready to help them. And we don't have that today.
That's what I was actually about to ask you, is if someone woke up, for example, I did not get in any trouble with my addiction. I didn't break any laws. I just got lucky, basically. But I didn't get caught, right? Is really the truth. So if I woke up in British Columbia and I wanted to get the help that I got here in the States, that's not available?
It depends where you live. So, you might be able to get it in Metro Vancouver. There might be an opportunity for detox for you, and there might be a free bed. But we have multiple communities, many, many communities where there is no detox available, where there's a limited number of mental health beds for people, where, the wait time for a treatment center could be 3 months or more. So unless you're able to pay privately, which many people are not, it may be out of reach. So this is where I agree actually with a lot of the kind of activists, which is that, you can't be totally reliant on a system where you're always compelling people into some type of service. You have to have both, because I think that there are many people, even those in our communities who are part of street disorder that we're seeing, or they're getting criminal entanglements, who, if they had the choice and that choice was easy and accessible, that they would make the choice and that they wouldn't need to be compelled. So, and along with that also goes the need for long-term care. I mentioned earlier that we have a significant population now of people who are living with acquired brain injuries, either from homelessness and living rough on the street, and having a brain injury from perhaps concussion, or who have anoxic brain injuries from not breathing, essentially, and then being woken up. And a lot of people that live on the streets here in Canada also had a brain injury before they went to the street. Maybe they had a brain injury at birth, or maybe a car accident, domestic violence, sports injury, coach, like a lot of people, they struggle. And one of the things is that we need to be able to provide care for people. And one of the saddest things that really keeps me up at night, and I do as a person in the legislature, I do wake up at night and I worry about these things for residents is that, there are people out there right now who really, they have a diminished capacity. They wouldn't be able to make a safe and smart choice. And I shouldn't say smart. I mean, like, they wouldn't be able to make that choice for themselves because they have lost a cognitive ability to do that. And that's horrifying to me. We need to really be taking care of these people and to find them, which is another way in which I think the court sort of system can help. It can actually help us triage people to determine, whether or not they're eligible for, going through that court program, or if perhaps they need something else. Maybe they're not fit to stand trial. And we need to find an alternative for those people.
And certainly the fitness to stand trial is important to that person, but that's an outlier. But that y'all make me think of a question, and I don't want to trivialize this. I mean this very seriously. I mean, it gets cold in Canada. I mean, it does, and that weather can impact somebody when they're homeless, unhoused, and living rough. So you have the reality of weather. And I'm wondering, with that understanding, with that premise, I've seen some folks in Canada on social media who just are beside themselves with anger that there'll be any type of enforcement about tent cities, if you'll allow that phrase, and they'll condemn the government and say, just let these people be, leave them alone. And I struggle as a person of faith, as a person in recovery, and a person who likes to talk about policy. With what is that? What is the appropriate response to a person living rough, but they may not have they may be in psychosis. They may have a medical condition that doesn't allow them to make decisions in a healthy manner. And where's the line between getting them physical safety out of the elements, getting them the opportunities for treatment, versus some folks in our community, the three of us, our brothers and sisters, go, just leave them be and get out of their way. I don't know what the answer is, but I'm curious to what your thoughts are.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really complicated. And one of the catch-22s that we're in here is that, I'll give you an example. There was a community where they had proposed some tiny homes for people who are currently living rough on the street. It got rejected ultimately. And the reason why the community members really got upset was because they had these tiny homes, but they have no detox beds in the city. Right. So there was no plan, no pathway for individuals who are in that situation to go. They go from the street, then they live in a shipping container, and then what happens? And they rejected it because it seemed to be that it didn't have any long-term plan for what would happen next. Would it just then become an organized homeless camp? Essentially, is what people were worried about. And
Right.
What we're dealing with too is that we have a government that has a terrible history over the last almost 9 years now of warehousing people with severe mental illness and addiction in places like hotels. So they would take over an entire hotel. They did this during the pandemic, but it was insufficient supports for the people, and they're still allowed to use drugs actively inside their suites. So it quickly invited drug dealers, quickly invited chaos and dangerous situation, even for the people who were working there to provide the supports, violence, and just people who live there themselves. Like, if you're trying to be a person who's trying to be sober, I mean, very difficult under those circumstances. But, there was a news story here, quite shocking. This one place, it's going to close down in the summer because FIFA is coming, so they got to clean it up. And so it's called the Lugat. It was the former Howard Johnson Hotel in the Granville district of Vancouver. And, nightclubs underneath this thing were just flooding constantly because people who were living there were flooding their units. There's fires. The fire department goes there like still on a daily basis, sometimes multiple times, police multiple times a day, stabbings. I think they've had homicides just outside, shootings for sure. One story of a person who was going to go down and rob the business below and ended up being stuck in a ventilation shaft. And if they hadn't found them, that person would perish, So this is the thing. We need to be able to we want to have housing for people. It has to be the right kind of housing. So there's a spectrum of people out there, obviously, who are unhoused right now. There's some people who actually work and live in their cars. That's a different kind of housing arrangement for that person than a person who is living in and out of psychosis on a daily basis with untreated schizophrenia or bipolar disorder and smoking crystal meth. Or a person who has lost their cognitive ability to the extent where they're functioning as a young child, because of repeated brain injury. And what we need to have is an entire landscape of housing. And I think what's been a challenge for the government is they lost in Canada and BC, they've lost the confidence of the public because of things like the LUGAT, because they've taken street people who had severe problems and need help and put them in these situations that were not conducive to wellness, ruined the neighboring businesses, and the neighborhood has suffered greatly. But we really do need, and this government is trying now to sort of backtrack on some of those policies and to move to different models. But you need to have long-term care for people who can no longer care for themselves. You need to have opportunities for those who don't need wraparound supports, like they truly are working and living in a car because of the cost of living crisis. Affordable housing or social housing, whatever. However you want to term that, but something where we give a person an opportunity they're not going to need the same kind of supports. In BC, they've only recently started saying that they would fund housing that's dry or sober housing. Previous to that, the majority of these housing projects that they have either safe consumption sites, which I don't agree with that term. I think supervised consumption site, there's nothing safe about having people get together in a room and watch each other overdose multiple times a day, in my opinion, but I digress. But, having more places, if you're a person who just got out of treatment and you need a place to stay, you need some supports, being surrounded by drug use and drug dealers and predatory behaviors is not a good place for you. And we need to support more opportunities for people who are leaving that bad situation, that unhealthy situation, moving towards health. We need to help support them in situations that are safe for them.
Coach, what do you got?
Wow. You have a lot of work ahead of you.
We've come so far.
Right.
We've come so far and we can do it. We can do it, Coach.
That's right. No doubt. I believe in it for sure. I like how I do believe that your first bet is the courts, though, to find out, right? That's where you're going to find out, can they stand for themselves, right? Can they get in front of a judge? Can they even represent themselves? And then having avenues and having opportunities for them to go to a place to get better. Because it's a scary world out there when you have that everywhere. Jeff asked the question and you had just said that you'd lose sleep over it. You lose sleep over the fact that you can't control it. And it's not necessarily a control thing. It's just opportunities, right? Opportunities for them to find a way. We had a guest on earlier and they had talked about the housing they created, and it was costing the government $600,000 a month for one of the buildings, and it was just insane. And it turned into everyone's doing recreational use, and it turned into drug dealers. It turned into all of these things. But I think it's just one step at a time, and I think you're killing it. I think you are, and I love that you're motivated to do it. This fires me up to hear that, because we're in our bubble, right? Everybody's in their bubble trying to figure out their space, and hearing things from you and hopefully stuff from us kind of helps, motivate the right people and the right people listening today, right? Like there are people trying to get better, and there are people, I like how you said you had the decriminalization experiment, and you said it started in 2023. And I was like, well, you got elected in 2022. I wonder how that came about. You're making it happen. So I think it's awesome. You're making it happen. So thank you so much for coming on today. And thank you for all the things that you shared.
Well, I appreciate the opportunity. I was a cop on the street before I became a politician, and the people who I saw suffering and sick who need our help. It's what motivated me to join politics, and I won't stop fighting until we do good by those people.
I want to end with a chance for you to make a comment. So there you are a serving police officer, which is very cool. To the rest of us, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, that's so impressive. And you enter into active addiction because of some lived experience you had, which led to PTSD as well. Then you do become a policymaker, an elected official. So you have the perspective, from law enforcement, from a person with lived experience, and then as a policymaker. And there are a lot of folks in law enforcement in America that will listen to this podcast. What's something we haven't talked about that, but what's a perspective that you would share with folks in American law enforcement about something that y'all have gotten right in Canada, or maybe something you've gotten wrong that impacts the law enforcement aspect of this?
Well, what we got wrong was, of course, I talked about that report that I was able to bring forward about the safe supply. Having not enough safeguards on programs meant to help that actually were harmful. Police played a big role, actually, in making sure the public knew that they were doing drug busts, getting these prescribed alternative drugs. And law enforcement officers do have a big role to play by, doing their press conferences and showing the public what's out there. And the extent of the demand for drugs in a community is always seen in the quantities that they seize. If nobody was looking for drugs, they wouldn't be having such big seizures.
Right.
I think it's important to know too, and I hope that, my fellow law enforcement officers and veterans in America know that I think sometimes people don't really realize the extent to which police officers care about the people on the street that we deal with. And I guess I'll just quickly tell you a story. Like, one of my last calls for service before I left policing was an overdose call. And it was raining. I got called. I was at the detachment doing paperwork, and I got called, and a person was outside in a puddle outside of a store. Security guards had their hands in their pockets when I got there. And this person had overdosed. They had a blue face. And so I gave them some nasal naloxone. And I actually didn't think that they would be revived, but I gave them 2 squirts. We had, at the time, a shortage of ambulances. No ambulance was coming. The firefighters were already on a call. And so there was nobody else coming. Other police officers were on their way. And so it's really stressful, obviously. And I remember at the time cradling the face of the person who had overdosed, and I could feel their whiskers, their beard through my gloved hand, the latex glove. And just, this was a human being whose life was really hanging in the balance. And I was afraid, but, sure enough, the Narcan worked and the person was revived. And the first thing that happened was that they asked where their drugs were. Mm-hmm. And this was de facto decriminalization at the time. So we were not confiscating pipes or foil or anything like that at the time. And I remember thinking to myself, I'd asked that person for their name. They were reluctant to give it to me, but they did, because I, said, hey, I just have to account for the medication I've given you. And I checked if they had warrants, and it turned out that person had already overdosed and needed reviving just across the bridge from my community earlier in the day. And then sure enough, like a few minutes later, the fireman ambulance came and they refused treatment, and they went away, and they said, where's my drugs? I wasn't finished. And they also said a few more colorful phrases to me when I woke up, but it's kind of part of the gig. And the thing was, at the time, I just remember thinking to myself, like, that's the power of addiction. Yeah. And that's the power of this monster, fentanyl, because it was just robbing this person of their very breath, right? Robbing them of their life. But it had such a hold on this poor soul that the first thing that they wanted to do when they woke up, the pain of their addiction, the pain of withdrawal, compels them to continue to use. And so without that intervention, without that kind of community to be there, without people to a place to go for recovery or treatment, or without those supports, like, how will this person have a chance? And so for frontline police officers, firefighters, paramedics, those on the front line of this crisis, like, first of all, the compassion fatigue that they're dealing with is enormous. But I would say to law enforcement and first responders that your voice matters. The love and care that you show to the people that you revive and help, and the families that you are with on a daily basis, what you're doing matters. Make sure that you do talk to your lawmakers in your state or in your province, in your country, so that they know that, what you see every day. And you might have great ideas. Like, so a lot of the things that I talk about and deal with, it's because of what I saw, or people who have, sadly died by suicide or overdose, that I've been involved in some capacity in their life as a law enforcement officer, is what compelled me to do what I do. So, what you're doing matters. It'll break through. Keep working together with organizations like yours, Coach, and Jeff, and just keep fighting, because, Canada is worth fighting for. America is worth fighting for. And the people, our neighbors are worth fighting for. So let's do this.
Let's go.
Wow. Elenore Sturko, law enforcement leader, person in long-term recovery, legislator, and leader for the recovery community of Canada and America. Thank you for joining Coach Scott Cochran and Jeff Breedlove on Real Talk about addiction and recovery with the American Addiction Recovery Association. Tell us this, where can folks find you on social media?
At Elenore Sturko on Twitter, and same thing on Instagram. I'm not on Facebook because Facebook thought I was parodying myself, which maybe I am, but anyway, look for me there. I also have a public email, eleanor.sturko.mla@leg.bc.ca. Reach out.
Well, good deal. Well, we will put all that on the post with this broadcast. Thank you so much for your leadership and taking time out to visit with us. And Elenore, we always say that recovery is real.
Recovery is real, and it's possible. Thanks for having me on.
Thanks.